So, Amber, it's really great to talk to you. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to be here, Brett.
So, today we're going to talk about a lot of different things. And one of the things I'm most interested in talking to you about is teaching for social justice. Recently, we spoke in a webinar about ways to guide discussions of controversial issues in classrooms when students disagree with each other. So, how do you plan and manage these types of discussions? You spoke earlier about the defund the police movement and students having perhaps different perspectives on that. I'm sure there are a lot of other issues that they might disagree on. How do you plan and enact these types of lessons where emotions are going to run high? Students are learning a lot outside of school about these issues. They all have their different identities that they bring to the table. Um, as an educator, as a guide, how are you thinking about managing those exchanges?
Yeah, and I actually really like that you said as a guide because I do think that's like so much of this kind of teaching. Like when you are teaching current events, if that's how you think about it, or if you're trying to like weave in contemporary examples, guiding students through what's going on, I think is really the approach. So, the first thing is I don't start the year this way. I don't start September, this is what we're going to do. I think setting expectations is very clear. I remember too in that webinar, I was really stressing the importance of basic routines. I don't think there's like some secret elixir that makes you like have a rigorous classroom where everyone respects each other. I think it really is as simple as one person talks at a time. Right, because
Hmm.
if you've already laid the framework for how to have a discussion, if you have the protocols and the routines down, and you do it with simple things, right? Like Yankees versus Mets, if you're in New York City. Um, when you get to the moments where it's like, is Donald Trump a good representative of America, right? Or if it's a policy question, which was something that we did discuss, like, well, is the immigration ban something that is good for the US? Like these kinds of questions that kids can get very passionate about. Like you've got kids that are like, yeah, like I don't think people should be allowed to come from these countries. And then you have people in the room who are, well, my family is from that country, right? So when you get to that point, then you have to fall back on your routines. And I'm not going to pretend like I've run perfect spaces where people do not get upset, but again, I think the guiding role of the teacher is like guiding students. What do you do when you're upset when someone says something you disagree with? And a big part of my classroom is like you can disagree with someone, but you can't dehumanize them. You can say, and this has happened less so now because I think it's become more common, but like there are students who will say, I just don't think two men should be able to get married. And you know, that gets a lot of students feeling personally attacked and heated. But at the end of the day, if a student has that opinion, that's the opinion that they have. It's just like, how do you express that opinion?
Hmm.
I think a great question is always to ask, why do you feel that way? That's why evidence and sources is so important.
Hmm.
I read a lot. Like I read a lot of news. I have lots of different places I get news from, and I think being transparent with kids about that too is important. Where it's like,
Hmm.
well, yeah, you can find someone that agrees with you in this source. So
Hmm.
if you're saying that thing, how are you backing it up with other sources and other
Hmm.
opinions?
Hmm.
Um, and I think that that's also really important. I used to debate. I debated competitively in high school, and a big part of that experience was like learning how to debate on your feet viewpoints that you don't believe in,
Hmm.
and and how to do that, and how
Hmm.
to make it sound persuasive.
Hmm.
Um, and I do think that those are experiences that students should have. Like, what does it feel like to listen to someone who's saying something you fundamentally disbelieve, you have to listen to it, right? I think that's a very different mandate than saying you have to sit in a room where someone is actively dehumanizing you, right? So a
Mhm.
big thing that we talk about in my classroom is language. When we did a whole unit on immigration, one of the things that we began early with was we are using the term undocumented people. We're not using the term the illegals,
Mhm.
right? Um, and I think again that goes a long way too towards like fostering the kinds of discourse that you want in a classroom. Um, there are just certain things that I think you have to be very firm on, and kids will
Mhm.
respect you for that. They're like, okay,
Mhm.
like Amber will let me say this in the
Mhm.
room
Mhm.
because she values my opinion, and we have a classroom community. We're all going to listen to each other, right? And that's why the protocols are so important. Like I
Could you
would
talk a bit
never have.
about the Sorry,
Mhm.
you mentioned the protocols a couple times, so I just wanna go back to that. Could you clarify what the protocols are?
Yeah, so there's like so many different exciting
Mhm.
protocols for
Mhm.
discussion. But
Mhm.
I think if you're just having like if you don't want to make it into a whole big thing, I
Mhm.
think basic protocols are that, I like to go around the room. If I have a classroom of 25 kids, it's like, okay, like here's the big question. The question's on the screen. Here are different things you might be thinking about to answer this question. I'll give everyone 2 minutes to write. Right. Journaling is so important, I think, in civics classes because it at least gives people space to
Mhm.
collect their thoughts. Right. I think this
Mhm.
is like a great thing in life too, where it's just really nice to sit and think and just be with yourself.
Yeah.
And I say that too. It's like it doesn't necessarily matter how much you write. No one's gonna read it except for you. But just like answer this question in your notebook. Um, and then you solicit responses, right? And one of the things is just that like I don't want any one person to dominate the conversation. We all know what it feels like when there's like the five kids in the room who love to talk all the time. So it's like, okay, here's our big question. We journaled about it. I'd love for people to share their thoughts. Oh, it's the same five kids. Okay, we'll start with that. They can all talk, and then it's like, okay, anyone else? Because I think that's also a part of it is that you need to create that community in your room where everyone's thoughts are valid. And journaling is a simple way to foster that. I think doing these kinds of things over and over again also fosters the feeling that kids have that your room is safe. You don't want to
Mhm.
just bust out a journal protocol when it is the January 6th insurrection for the first time and say, okay, like, what do you think about these people climbing the walls of the Capitol? Go. Um, but
Mhm.
that kind of routine is just really important. So
You also mentioned
these
the boundaries, yeah.
mhm. So boundaries in terms of like what we discuss.
Yeah, you mentioned, so you mentioned protocols and things that you do, and that I love that example of the protocols that you gave with, journaling. Um, you mentioned that nobody can be dehumanized, and I wonder about that because it seems like it could be a vague boundary. Somebody might
Yeah,
feel
I
dehumanized with a from a certain opinion that somebody has, like the one you said, if somebody supports the Muslim ban, somebody might take that extremely personally.
right. And I'm not going to deny the reality of
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
Um I think for me it's more well, it's not more. It's I can think of some very concrete examples of this. So, an example of dehumanization in my room would be if someone has chosen pronouns that they like to go by,
Mm.
pronouns that
Mhm.
that is that's who they are, that's what they want to be called, and someone just refuses to do that in the room in the
Mhm.
moment of a heated debate. That to me is an example of dehumanization because that's personal. Right. It's not the idea the person is expressing at that point. It is literally
Mhm.
their identity. That's that to me is the
Mhm.
line. I think yes, you can definitely have conversations in your room where people can be really offended by ideas. Um we're discussing the First Amendment right now in my class, and one of the things that comes up is the fact that offensive expression is protected under the First Amendment. And we've had lots of back and forths about that because kids will say, well, that's wrong. You shouldn't be able to do that. But the counter argument is like, well, what's offensive to you may not necessarily be offensive to someone else. So I think I think a lot about that because the last thing I would ever want someone to feel in my classroom is like it was a free for all and someone piled on them. Um, but
Mhm.
when we talk about, I say it's okay to be offended by an idea. And I think again, it's like building the frameworks and the protocols in your room to make that clear. It's like, yes, we can disagree. Um, but the disagreement does not cross the line into like criticizing somebody's personal identities or the things that make them who they are. If we're discussing the Muslim ban and that there's a student in the room who's hijabi, and this has happened before, it's like you can't single that student out as an example of a person that is potentially
Mhm.
being kept out of America, right? That becomes personal. So as much as
Yeah.
possible, I do try to guide students into evidence-based discussion. Like like keep it in the text, like where are you seeing that? What does it actually say? Can you quote that please? Um
Mhm.
to build the idea that like we don't just talk on the fly about serious things.
Mhm. 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 Well, that is I'm learning so much from what you're saying. This makes a lot of sense, and that it does seem like a tricky line. Like it's like have you ever found yourself in a situation where you're thinking to yourself, I don't know if a student crossed the line or not, but I'm
Yes.
going to yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
I can I've been there too as a teacher. Yeah.
and it's hard because you don't, and this is the thing I think people don't understand about classroom teaching is that so much of it is in the moment, right? So
Mhm.
I had a year. This was the 2016 school year. So September of 2016 to June of 2017. That was a very everything was potentially a tinderbox because I had a lot of students who were very anti-Trump, but I also had a very vocal contingent of students who were very much in favor of him being president. And a lot of those students were not the students you would necessarily assume. They were of color, right? So it was just a tinderbox.
Mhm.
And that was a
Mhm.
year that made me feel like I really learned a lot about discussion because I really had to
Mhm.
sit and think about how am I asking this question and who's going to raise their hand first.
Mhm.
And so that's also part of it is knowing your students and knowing that class because we've all had classes where we're like, this is going to have to be very different than it was in the two classes before because of who's in the room and the time of day and
Mhm.
sometimes even the
Mhm.
weather.
Mm. Have they
So
gotten their
I,
energy out or not, or do
exactly,
they
like,
have to
what
let it
was
out?
for
Yeah.
lunch? What
Mhm,
was for
mhm,
lunch that day? Like,
mhm.
did they have a substitute right before? Like, these
Yeah.
are all things you kinda need to have your feelers out for. And
Mhm,
obviously, like, that's something you can't plan for, but this is why having really tight questioning is so important. Like, I learned a lot that year where I really had to script out questions because I also had some students who really like to play with language,
mm,
right? And they're like, "Well, you said this." That's like, "Man, I did say that." Because I was trying to figure out how to ask a question to not make so and so
mm.
shoot up their hands with a smirk on their face.
Yeah, it's a
So
balancing act. Mhm,
again, it's such a balancing act, and that's why I do it. It's never a dull moment.
mhm, mhm,
And kids feel that too. I mean,
mhm,
they feel like we're gonna talk about some real things, and I think framing their responsibility that way. Like I do start my classes this way every year where it's like we're going to talk about some controversial things.
Mhm.
Controversy is a vocabulary word. And it's just like, oh, psh, whatever, like it's just vocabulary. But then by like 3 months in, it's like, well, minimum wage is a controversial issue. Gun control is a controversial issue. We're going to have different viewpoints about it. Right? So it is like at least building the understanding that yeah, like you guys thought I was playing. Like you thought I was joking when I said we're going to like have some fights in this room. But
Mhm.
no, we are because you will be shocked by how much you actually care about things like the voting age.
Mhm. 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 Well, thank you so much, Amber. It's real I wish we could keep talking, but, I'm really enjoying this and hearing about everything that you do, and, you have a lot of wisdom of practice and so much experience to draw on, so, um, thank you for taking this hour to talk to me.
It's
Oh,
been
okay.
such a pleasure to be interviewed by you and having you ask these amazing questions. It kept me on my toes. And
Alright.
thank you so much.
Alright, take care. Okay, bye-bye.